Hi, good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Good day, comrades. Good day and welcome to our very first for this year and very first installation of TUTA Saturdays. TUTA Saturdays, Education Matters. So I am your host for this evening, none other than your first Vice President, Mr. Marlon Seals. I'm here with my team from the PAC, the Professional Advancement Committee of the Association, and a committee some will say is one of the most important committees of the association. And with us is a month of the teacher committee. Again, a committee that celebrates the work of teachers during this month of October. So without any further ado, I would like to start with God. I would like to start this evening's proceedings by inviting God among our presence. And to do that, we will all engage in a moment of silent reflection and or prayer. Thank you. So again, welcome comrades to this engagement, very first engagement of TUTA Saturdays, Education Matters. And with us, we are starting with a bang, right? We are starting where we're supposed to start. We are starting looking at the overall inclusive education model, but we focusing in on the work of the very important work of the Student Support Services Division. And we will start with S.E.A concessions, but we'll look at the other services that they provide, because we as educators know that we really supposed to look and focus on those persons who are more vulnerable within our system, as we often see that rising tides raises all boats. All right. So ladies and gentlemen, without any further ado, I would like to welcome to our sitting today Ms. Jenny Garcia from the Student Support Services Division of the Ministry of Education. Ms. Garcia, the floor is yours.
A very pleasant good afternoon to all teachers present, and I'll start with my thanks to the PAC of TUTA for inviting me to share with you all this evening on something that's very close to my heart, and that's children with special needs. This evening, Mr. Seals would have started off with the responsibility of Student Support Services Division in addressing the needs of students within our inclusive education setting. And certainly when the division was created 18 plus years ago, it was developed to help to support all students in our mainstream classes and in the mainstream education setting. And so the design of student support services was really intended to be a multi-pronged design. And that is the reason that we have within our division 4 separate units: the guidance and counseling unit, special education unit, the school social work unit, and of course the developmental assessment and intervention unit. And all of these units were really designed to support our students and as well to support the teachers who are providing instruction for these students on a daily basis. We've been asked this afternoon to present on a very particular topic, and that is the issue of special concessions. And I hope at the end of this session, you all will be able to have a better understanding of what concessions are, why concessions are provided for students with special needs, and understand as well what is required to access these special concessions. So special concessions or concessions are alterations to the standard format of assessment or the conditions under which an examination or assessment is done in order to accommodate the special education needs of our students. And so we're going to look at that definition, but we're going to dissect it so that persons will have a better understanding of what that means. So when we talk about alterations, what we're talking about is making adjustments or changes to the standard format of the assessment. And as educators, we understand what is the standard format of that assessment. The standard format is the paper and pen paper that the students are given. So the students are provided with an examination paper, and they are expected to be able to write and give their responses to that paper. That is the standard format. When we talk about the conditions under which a child is expected to write an exam, we also are aware in our education system, those conditions are a shared space within the school. So we have rooms or we have spaces where all of the children collectively sit for the writing of the examination. And the second condition that we have is that our exams are a timed exam. So regardless of the level that the child is writing that exam with, if we return in 2023 to our national tests or our performance assessments that they will do at the lower levels, that is going to be given under certain formats and under certain conditions. The S.E.A. exam has a standard format and standard conditions. At the secondary level, NCSE exams have their standard format and standard condition. And of course, CSEC, although that examination is not governed by our Ministry of Education, the exam itself also follows a standard format and specific conditions. So when we speak to concessions, we're looking at altering or adjusting that standard format or the conditions under which the children write the exam. And it's done for a very specific purpose. It is done to accommodate the special education needs of our students. It's important to understand that while people have sometimes the misconstrued impression that alterations provide an advantage for our children with special needs, these conditions really don't provide an advantage. What they do is to reduce or eliminate the effects of the challenge. So each disability or each special need that a child has will impose certain challenges for that child. The child who is blind, for example, cannot see the exam or the written format of the exam. The child who is deaf cannot hear the verbal instructions that are given. A child who has a learning disability may have a challenge of processing in the same way that another child is able to process, or with the speed with which another child is able to process. And so when we look at reducing or eliminating the effects of the challenge, it is in the context that every disability or special need that a child has is going to impose certain challenges to that child's functioning. So when we speak to concessions, we speak to concessions providing equity, not advantage. And we speak about leveling the playing field. And I think as educators, TTUTA has done a good job of exploring that discourse of equity. So we understand that all of our children must have access to equitable circumstances. They must have equitable access to schooling. And certainly in the examinations format or in that discourse, it's important that they have equitable access to passing that exam as everyone else. So concessions do not reduce, and this is also important, they do not reduce the learning expectations. So although we will adjust the format and although we adjust the conditions to accommodate the students' need, when it comes to marking of that examination, the students are expected to have the same learning outcomes. So I am not going to adjust my marking. That is not going to be considered a concession. The marking is going to remain the same because the expectations for that student is going to remain the same. And so oftentimes you may hear the debate of asking for a reader for a child who has a learning disability, or for the child who cannot read. Providing a reader in that context is not going to create an equitable condition. It is going to create an advantageous condition. So they do not reduce the expectations that we have for all of our students. And so in our context, speaking specific to the S.E.A, the expectation is that all students enrolled for that exam is going to be able to read that exam paper independently and write the exam. And so the expectation is going to be the same. The expectation is that students will acquire at least a minimum of 30% to cross over to secondary school. The expectation is the same as well for our children with special needs. So the equity is created in the sitting of the exam. It is not created in the marking of the papers. In order to accommodate special education needs of a student, and we understand again that those special education needs are varied. And so it's important for us to understand as teachers and as educators, what are these categories of special needs that they are referencing when it comes to concessions. So we have a number of different classifications of special needs or disabilities. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual gives one classification for children with special needs and disabilities. The International Classifications of Diseases is another system to classify children with special needs. And this category that we have listed on the screen are the Ministry of Education's guidelines on the administration of special concessions. So while we have different classifications of disabilities, the one that we're referencing this evening is the one contained in that concessions guideline document that is available on the Ministry of Education website. So we're going to stick to the focus of these 5 categories as we explore the importance of concessions for these groups of children. In our schools, we recognize that the largest population of children with special needs are our children with medical conditions. So many teachers are still unaware that medical conditions give a child the right to access concessions on the day of the exam. So as educators in a system, we recognize that because we are including everyone in the same roof, we have many children with medical conditions. So you can think of the children who are asthmatic and understand that even though asthma is a very simple medical condition, it can also be very severe in its presentation. So although asthma is very common in our education system, there is a core group of children who have severe asthma, who will be hospitalized for prolonged periods of time, who can have a severe asthma attack that will result in them having to go to the hospital. And so as simple as asthma is, we understand that it's one of those areas where children are very vulnerable. We have children with seizure disorders in our school. And as a special education teacher, I find that the number of children that we are becoming aware of with seizures have increased over the last 2 years. I cannot say for what reason. There is no data to support it, but we seem to be encountering more children with seizures in our education system and within our classroom setting. We have children with cancer, children who have leukemia, children who have diabetes, and all of these issues or all of these medical conditions are going to create challenges for the children. So while we continue the discussion, in the back of your mind, I want you to start thinking of what are some of the challenges that would be created for a child who is diabetic? What are some of the challenges that may be created for a child who has a seizure disorder? What are some of the challenges that may be impacting a child who has asthma, or I'm missing all of these diagnoses all of a sudden. But when you think of medical conditions, I want you to think of those medical conditions in the context of the challenges that they are going to create. A second category of special need is physical and sensory impairments. And again, in our inclusive education setting, we have children with physical impairments within our school setting. Cerebral palsy, muscular dystrophy, spina bifida are just a few of these that are physical in terms of the category of needs. And so again, when we think of these children, when we think of a child who has mild cerebral palsy, the challenge that child is going to encounter is not going to be as great as the child who has severe or is on the severe end of that cerebral palsy and is unable to hold his pencil and is unable to write for himself. So the degree of the disability is also going to impact the concession that is granted to this child. So while I may have a physical impairment and it is going to interfere with my ability to walk, that physical impairment may not impair my ability to write. And so again, when concessions are considered for children, it is in the context of the degree of challenge experienced by the child. Sensory impairments is also a consideration that we make in terms of categories in our school. So in our schools and in different schools, we have different degrees of these impairments, but we certainly know that there are children who are hearing impaired in our classes and those that are deaf. We have children who are visually impaired in our classes, and some of us have children who are blind. We have children as well who have speech impediments, and there are children, of course, who are mute, who cannot speak. And so when we look at these sensory impairments in the context of concessions, it is also to examine how are these impairments creating a challenge for this child? What are the challenges that will be present in an exam setting that will impose a challenge, I guess, for a child who is writing an exam? And so I look at, again, a child who is deaf. A child who is deaf cannot hear the oral instructions that the teacher is giving during the exam. A child who is blind cannot see the written format of the examination. A child who is speech impaired, while we might say it's not an oral exam, we have to understand that the child who has a speech and language impairment, the language development is also impacted by the presence of that speech and language impairment. So even though the child is not expected to give oral responses, we understand that speech is not the only thing impacted by a speech and language disorder. Their language development and therefore their use of language and their understanding of language, which is the expressive and the receptive parts of the language, are also going to be impaired. So when I look at the challenges created by that particular disability, I understand why certain types of concessions are considered for those children. In our education system, we are seeing increasing numbers of children with learning disabilities. And again, for the purpose of our concessions guidelines, learning disabilities, according to the policy guidelines, includes specific learning disabilities in math, language, and written expression. And it also includes attention deficit and autism. Again, there are other classifications that will place autism and ADHD in different categories. But for the purpose of our concessions guidelines, we are being guided specifically by the categories that are contained inside that document. And so learning disabilities will impact your child. I may have a learning disability and I am impaired in my processing speed. It means that it's going to take me a longer time to read and understand what the question is asking. So I am maybe given a consideration for that extended time because of the challenge that is created by my learning disability. If I have an attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, it means that my focus is going to be a challenge. It means that my sustained attention is going to be a challenge. How do I support a child who has attention issues in the examination setting so that I can create equitable conditions for him and equitable means through which he can write his exam? And so when we look at those considerations, again, That is what is looked at to make a decision whether this child will get a concession for the exam or not. If you have had the experience in your classroom of children with autism, you understand that there are any multiple needs or challenges that that child may have. Every autistic child is different, and every autistic child has different challenges and different needs. And so the concessions committee will look at the needs of that specific child in the context of the exam to determine what supports will be provided for that child. We live in an increasingly traumatizing society and environment. And so because of that, we have to make consideration for those children's special circumstances. What are special circumstances? Think of those children in your classroom that are challenged by certain situations or circumstances in their life. Sexual abuse creates a challenge for a child. I cannot see or fathom how a child who has been exposed to any degree of abuse or violence has the expectation to do the same and function the same as other children. So we have to make consideration for that child's special circumstances. Death of a parent close to the exam are special circumstances. Exposure to violence in a community, if sometimes things happen and the child is completely traumatized, that is a special circumstance. A few years ago, I don't know if you all will recall, but the young child who was in a home where the home was invaded, a home invasion occurred either the night or 2 nights before the S.E.A. exam. Those are special circumstances. And if we're trying to create equitable circumstances for all of our children, we have to recognize that those special circumstances create challenges for our children that we hope the concessions is going to mitigate on the day of the exam. As educators, we also understand emergencies. 2 weeks before the exam, the child decides to go out and play football, he breaks his foot. That is an emergency. That's something that we couldn't cater for 2 weeks or 2 months or 2 terms in advance when the concessions process began. If the child gets into a vehicular accident and a hand is broken and all of a sudden the child is unable to write for himself, but the parents are insistent that the child must write the exam, that qualifies as an emergency. And so within the concessions guidelines, there is stipulated that some emergencies can be considered prior to the exam, whether it's 2 weeks before the exam or 3 weeks before the exam. Because you would appreciate by this time, concessions have already been processed, decisions have already been made. So when a child comes in with that nature of an emergency, it is to determine if the ministry and student support services can provide support for that child in that short space of time, or if the recommendation is going to be that the child does the makeup exam. And so when we look at special education needs, as we move forward in the discussion, I want you to keep in mind not only the categories of needs, but the challenges that are going to be created, because each specific special need creates very specific challenges for the child, and the degree of that disability, whether it's mild or moderate or severe, is also going to be a part of the consideration for that concession that is eventually granted. So we want to examine pieces of the definition that we've already discussed. When we talk about alterations to the standard format of an assessment or the conditions, I want you to think of 4 things, sorry. 1, how the examination is presented. And as I said, we understand in our system, we have a paper exam. And so the children are presented with a paper on which they are supposed to write. How are the children expected to give a response to the exam? The standard format stipulates that that child is expected to write his answer in the examination paper. What is the condition of the setting? The setting stipulates that all children must write the exam in the same physical space. What is the scheduling that is the standard? The standard is that as it relates to any exam, the same time is given to every child writing the exam. And so when we speak to concessions and alterations, we have to understand that what we are altering is how the exam is presented, how the children are expected to respond, in what setting they're going to write the exam, and the time considerations given for those children with special needs. And it's also important to understand as we move forward in the discussion that not every child receiving a concession is going to receive the same concession. The concession that is given is to ensure that that child, as a result of the special needs that he has, or that specific need that he has as a result of the disability, is given one or more concession to enable him to write that exam. So how can I alter the presentation of the exam? In what ways are we allowed to adjust the presentation of the test materials and the instructions? As we go through, I want you all to think, who is the child that this particular paper is being presented in this particular manner for? I looked at the presentation of Braille. There is only one category of need that would require a child to be presented with a Braille paper on the day of the exam. And that need is blindness. So if my child has a disability that is blindness, the child can be presented with a Braille paper. As you may be aware, many of our students would have spent or may have spent some time at School for the Blind, where they would have learned to read Braille. And so the paper can be presented in Braille for those children who are blind and writing the exam and proficient in Braille. For the child who is visually impaired, I can give that child large print. And so the importance of understanding, again, the degree of blindness or the degree of visual impairment is highlighted by the fact that the severity of this child's condition is what is going to make the difference between the large print and the Braille. And so again, if I am visually impaired and I am unable to see the normal font that is presented at the S.E.A. exam or at any other exam, I can request of the ministry to provide me with large print so that I can write my exam independently. A child who is deaf or hearing impaired can be given an interpreter. And this is something that sometimes people get a little confused about because they assume interpreter is an interpreter of language. So the child who is Chinese is writing the exam, he should get an interpreter. But in the context of our concessions guideline, an interpreter is very specific. It is a hearing interpreter for the hearing impaired and deaf students. And so for that child writing the exam, the interpreter is going to interpret the oral instructions given. That interpreter is not going to read the exam for the child. The interpreter is only there for the purpose of giving sign for the oral instructions. The only part of the examination on any day, whether it's S.E.A, national test, NCSE, CSEC, that is given verbally are the instructions. So the only thing that that interpreter is going to sign is the instructions that are given. So that's also important for us to note. We are not yet at the stage where we give interpreters for language, meaning a Chinese child, a Venezuelan child, all right? Remember at the beginning when we talked about what concessions did, it was clearly stated that concession does not change the expected outcomes to the child, the expectations, the learning expectations. And so if you are writing an examination in Trinidad, if you are writing an S.E.A examination in Trinidad, the expectation is going to remain that you are going to be able to independently read that paper and give your responses in the language in which it's given, which is the standard English. All right. The last one that we have here in terms of how it's presented is the reader. The reader, again, and not for those children who cannot read or have difficulty reading because they have a learning disability in reading. The reader is given again to children who are blind. Why is that accommodation given for children who are blind? It is given for a child who is blind because they cannot see the physical paper. And so, again, there has been argument over the years that children who have a specific learning disability in reading should be given a reader. But that is going to go against the importance of giving a concession for equity and not advantage. The expectation for the child who has a learning disability is going to be the same, that the child is going to be able to read the exam independently and give a response. Why, again, does the child who is blind have it? It is simply because that child cannot visually access the paper, and the only means through which they can access the paper is through someone reading for them. So if I am blind and I know Braille, yes, I can have a Braille paper, but if I am blind and I don't know how to read Braille, a Braille paper will not give me access to the exam. I have to have a reader who reads the exam for me. And in the case of a reader, they are reading every single item on the exam paper. What are the alterations that I could make to the responses that the children give? I can adjust the manner in which the student responds. I can adjust the manner in which the student answers questions. So I can give to the child who is blind and unable to write her own answers the ability to give oral responses, which someone will dictate or write for them. For the child who has the Braille format, I can allow them to give their responses transcribed in Braille. So again, a child who is deaf does not need an alteration of having a writer, for the exam. A child who has a learning disability does not need to have someone write for the exam. A child who has a sensory impairment may not need someone to write for the exam. Also in this category of needs are children who have physical disabilities that are severe, however. And so if I have cerebral palsy or I have muscular dystrophy and I am unable to write that pen, use that pencil and write my answers or transcribe my own answers, I am given someone who can write for me. And so again, some of us may have had the experience of having a child who has a physical disability, and that child's intellectual processes are intact. They're able to cognitively function at a level sometimes higher than the typical children in our class, but that child is unable to write independently. And so I create that equitable condition for him by allowing him to verbally say his answers and to have someone transcribe or write those answers for him. So again, how the child is allowed to respond can be adjusted in an exam. I can alter the conditions under which the assessment is done. So we talked about those setting accommodations. Setting means that the physical space where the child writes the exam. Some of our children with special needs need to have an adjustment to the physical environment. Some children may get preferential seating. That means that I place the child in a specific condition, in a specific location that accommodates their particular special needs. So I want you to think of, for example, a child who has a medical condition. And that medical condition, one of the characteristics is incontinence. That child uses the bathroom frequently. I can give that child a space that is close to the bathroom to accommodate the challenge that is created by his disability, which is the challenge in this case is incontinence. So that's an example of preferential seating. Because of the challenge created or because of the special need created by that particular disability, I am creating a concession to accommodate his needs. Most of our concessions to the exams, all of the concessions to the exams are accommodated in a separate room. We place the children in a separate room because they are writing the exam under concessions conditions. For example, if my child needs a break every 20 minutes because they have attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, I don't want to have that child sitting in the main area because it's going to become a distraction for the other students. If my child is autistic and he needs or engages in rocking to comfort himself, or he makes small noises during the exam, as I'm sure you are aware some of our children do, or if he's flapping when he becomes frustrated in the exam, I want that child in a separate space so that he can be comfortable and the other students writing the exam are not distracted. If I have a child who is diabetic and that child needs to test his sugar levels, or she needs to take medication, or that child needs to drink water, I don't want to have that kind of disruption in my main setting. That child is placed in a separate room. We do have children who have had seizures on the day of the exam. Again, if you are aware or have ever experienced a seizure, it can be a very frightening experience for our children. So we place those children in a separate room so that they can be monitored closely, but it is also in consideration of the other children writing the exam, because these circumstances can create distraction and disruption on the day of the exam. There are occasions where we give considerations, and these are just two examples: special lighting, adaptive aids. There are children who, because of their physical disability and the need for them to be comfortable during writing, are given special chairs that they come into the exam room with. We have children who are given certain adaptive devices as long as it is accounted for in some kind of documentation to say that there is a need. There are children coming in the exam room sometimes with mechanical pencils and minor variations to what is the standard. And again, that is not giving favoritism or allowing advantage. It is just giving that child equitable conditions so that they can write the examination successfully. We understand that this is one of the most sought after concessions, and that is the scheduling concessions that are given, because there is an impression that extended time automatically makes the exam easier for the children. We understand as well, though, for educators, that some of our children struggle through just the regular time that is given. So while time concessions are certainly the most sought after concessions in our experience in Student Support Services Division, time concession is the one that everybody wants because they feel that it's going to afford the child a greater opportunity to complete the work. Time concessions for some of the categories of needs really create a disadvantage. When we talk about time allowances for the exam, there are two particular kinds. One is afforded to our children with disabilities. The other is given to anyone writing the exam. Extended time is a stipulated amount of time that is added to the regular time of the exam. So think in the context of the S.E.A. exam that is 75 minutes long, that extended time will mean that the child has 75 minutes and then an additional 20 minutes that is fixed. So extended time is one way of giving our children an equitable circumstance to write the exam. Who will get extended time? If I have a learning disability, a specific learning disability in reading, writing, or written expression, that extended time will afford me the opportunity to process the work that I have to do, to process the information that is given, to process the question, and to try to process the response that I wish to provide. Extended time can be given to the child who is reading because they cannot write for themselves. So the person has to be writing their dictated sentences. You would appreciate that that child will need extra time to get all of their responses out. The child who is blind or visually impaired and has a reader, because they are not accessing that directly and there is a person helping them to access the exam, that person needs extra time because the person will have to read the questions or the sentences or the passages to them, and they will have to respond orally, and the person now has to write those answers. And so extended time is not just something that is given or thrown into the mix. Extended time has a very specific purpose to meet some very specific needs of some of our children with disabilities writing the exam. Where can extended time be a disadvantage? A child who has attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, who has a difficult time sitting for 75 minutes, will not be able to access comfortably that additional time. That child is going to become frustrated. He is going to become very difficult to manage, and it is going to go downhill from there. A child who has autism or who has a very low frustration tolerance, if you extend the length of that child's exam, it is going to end up, placing that child in a disadvantageous position. And so while extended time is sought after by so many of our teachers and parents, we have to understand the purpose of the extended time and the fact that not all children will benefit from that extended time. Compensatory time is given to all of our students writing the exam. That simply means if I get up to use the bathroom, I can get that time back added at the end of the exam. If I have an asthma attack or an anxiety attack and I spend 30 minutes calming myself back so that I can return to the classroom, that 30 minutes is extended or added, to the end of that exam. And so compensatory time is listed in our concessions because there are many of our children who require what we call scheduled breaks or breaks as needed. And so if, as I said, if I am diabetic, I need to take a break to test my sugar levels, to eat, to drink, to take medication. The time that I use for that activity is added at the end of the period. If I am asthmatic and I need to take a puff, that time is added at the end of the period. If I have attention deficit and it is advised that I get breaks in between, I need to get up and move and do something in order to calm myself back to return to the exam. The time that I take on my breaks are, of course, added back to the time of the exam. Alterations to the conditions under which the assessment is done. There is not an arbitrary adding of time for the exam, so that's important for us to understand as well. The time allocated to students in terms of the number of additional minutes is specified and it varies based on the nature of the need. And so in most cases, 25% additional time is allotted, and that works out to roughly 20 minutes. So for the child who is writing the exam and gets extended time based on a learning disability, the child who gets the extended time based on a physical impairment, the child who gets the extended time based on a medical condition, and I'm saying medical conditions here because we have to appreciate that some medical conditions have our children suffering from chronic pain. And so, for example, rheumatoid arthritis. We do have children in the system with rheumatoid arthritis. That is a medical condition, but it impairs the children's ability to write with ease to themselves. And so writing can be very slow and very labored. The child who has cancer as well can be impacted by their general health, and they can be impacted by the medication as well. So there are some medical conditions that because of the medication taken, the children do become lethargic, but they want to write independently. And so sometimes they are afforded extended time as well. Generally, extended time is, as I said, the 20 minutes. So you have mathematics, children working under concessions for the exam will have 95 minutes to finish their math as opposed to 75. The children writing the language arts under time concessions will have 95 minutes instead of the basic 75. And the children doing the creative writing will have 65 minutes instead of the basic 50. When you have children, however, operating on the severe end of the disability spectrum, you are looking at an additional 40 minutes. So the children who have writers assigned, and again, just as a reminder, a child who is blind can have a writer reader. A child who is physically disabled, if they are unable to write for themselves, can have a writer in the exam. Because of how time consuming dictating your sentences and having someone write them out can be for you, according to the circumstance and according to the severity of the diagnosis, those children can be given an additional 14 minutes. So for those children with severe disabilities, blindness as an example, severe physical disabilities as another example, those children get 75 plus 40 for math, 75 plus 40 for language, and 50 plus 30 for the creative writing components. Alterations to the conditions under which the assessment is done, as I explained in terms of compensatory time, it simply means that time lost is returned to the student. And again, the emphasis on medication, rest breaks, bathroom breaks, eating, and so on. During this time, it is extremely important for the tester to make a record of the breaks and the time taken away from breaks. So if I am assigned as a tester in a space with a child who has ADHD, and that child has been given the concessions of extended time, then I must record not only the number of breaks that he has taken, but the length of each break to add it at the end of the exam. And a reminder that any student can be given compensatory time. There are other accommodations that are made for our students with disabilities. Close monitoring is critical for many of our children. There are children who have been diagnosed with autism, with ADHD, certain medical conditions, certainly seizure disorders is one of them. Some children who have been diagnosed even at this stage with psychiatric issues such as depression and anxiety. Those children are closely monitored in a separate room during the exam because we understand that their threshold for frustration is compromised, and therefore we want to be able to look at them, to monitor them closely for signs of distress, for signs of fatigue, for signs of frustration, because if the child is crumbling during the exam, we want to be able to intervene at the beginning of that meltdown or at the beginning of that episode rather than at the end. Scheduled breaks have already been mentioned, and these are for many of our children across disability categories. I can have scheduled breaks if I am diabetic. I can have a scheduled break if I have autism. I can have scheduled breaks if I have ADHD. I can also have breaks as needed. So if a situation arises, then my tester and the person supporting me on the day of the exam can intervene immediately. Also important in terms of other accommodations is that sometimes our parents are asked to be on standby on the day of the exam. What does that mean? It means that if your child is writing the exam in school A, we want you in close proximity to school A. If your child has a seizure disorder, we want you to be able to come quickly to the school. If your child has chronic asthma and he has an asthma attack, we want you to be able to respond quickly and come to the school. We have had children who have fainted on the day of the exam. Some of these children are just our typical developing children, but for our children with special needs, because we are aware in advance of what are some of the potential challenges on the day of the exam, we try to mitigate that by having the parents on standby. Sometimes it is to come to take the children to the hospital. Sometimes it is to come to administer emergency medication. And so we want you all close by on that day of the exam. Excuse me. Who are the personnel that will administer concessions on the day? We have many. We have the reader of instructions only. That is again for our children who are unable to just access those oral instructions. And then we have the reader of the entire paper for the children who may be blind, for example, and unable to access the paper through Braille. And so there are persons that are there only to read sometimes the instructions. And who would be the children who would need the reader of instructions? If I am hearing impaired, for example, and I am unable to hear the general tester who is reading the exam instructions, then I can have someone to read the instructions for me only. Only the instructions are written, are read, because that child is hearing impaired, and so they only need access to the oral part of the exam. The rest of the exam is written, so they don't need a reader for the rest of the exam. The children who are blind will need a reader of the entire paper if they are not able to access the paper independently or access Braille paper. Writer scribe is given. The writer scribe is given for the child who is severely physically impaired and unable to write independently. the writer scribe is also given for the child who is blind and will not be able to write independently. There is a unique category of needs in some of our schools. Many teachers may never have encountered this particular disability, but there are children who we call deafblind. They are both deaf and blind, and so they cannot do or function in that exam independently. Those children need both the reader and the writer to do that for them. And finally, our interpreter, who is there for the children who are deaf, and their function is only to interpret the oral instructions that are given. The rest of the paper is given in visual format, so they can therefore access and respond to it. The interpreter reads only those instructions that are given orally. You would appreciate that the documentation for these concessions are important. If documentation was not important, everybody would successfully apply and acquire concessions on the day of the exam. There are forms that are required for the concession to be processed, and those are parent and school concessions done by the parent and the class teacher. Medical documentation must be available to verify every single disability that is there of a medical nature. That medical cannot be older than 1 year. So I cannot provide for the ministry a 5-year-old medical saying that my child is or has seizure disorder. That must be current and within 1 year of the exam. So next year's exam is in March of 2023. Medical should be dated later than March of 2022. In terms of psychoeducational assessments, those must be done within 3 years. Any assessment document must be within 3 years. So if it's a speech and language evaluation, if it's a psychoeducational evaluation, if it's a psychological evaluation, those must happen within 3 years. So the exam is in 2023. The oldest that that concession, that psychoed assessment should be is 2019. All right, so before 2019, it is going to be considered an invalid psychoeducational assessment or an invalid speech and language assessment. And so it's important for us as well to be aware so that we can share with parents, Mom, you have an outdated document, Dad, this is not going to be considered because it's out of date. And so it's important that you be aware so that you can make your parents aware of some of these guidelines. There are governing bodies, understandably, that will govern the concessions process. Locally, we have a concessions committee that operates out of the Ministry of Education, and it comprises members of Student Support Services Division, the Examinations Unit, the District School Supervision, various ministries within Student Support Services Division, Examination Section, as well as personnel that can assess the worthiness of the documents that are coming in. So on that concessions committee, there is a psychologist, and that psychologist determines whether or not the psychoeducational assessment validates the need for extended time or separate room or scheduled breaks. There is a medical practitioner who consults with the concession committee on medical documentation coming in. So you may find the child presents with a medical condition, but when you look at what they're requesting, it doesn't match the medical condition that the child has. Over the years, I've seen persons, for example, write a dermatologist would have sent in a medical requesting extended time because the child has dermatitis. And so the medical practitioner is going to evaluate whether or not this child really, as a result of the medical condition, requires a concession. Regionally, the Caribbean Examinations Council is responsible for administering and looking at and reviewing those concessions requests. And so for children writing the C.S.E.A examination, that process is done under C.S.E.A, and the Ministry of Education has absolutely no control over that situation. The timelines and the deadlines are stipulated by the Ministry of Education. And this is important to mention because while Student Support Services Division may give some leeway When a concession comes in after the deadline, we ask principals to send it to the CEO's office. If the CEO's office says that the instruction coming from the office is that the concessions must be processed, then internally, although the deadline has passed, we are required, because of the instruction from the CEO, to accommodate the late concessions. C-SEC as a governing body does not have or is not obligated to make any accommodations to late concessions. So we have to be mindful that all of the local exams is decided, those concessions are decided upon by our concessions committee, which is internal to Student Support Services Division and internal to the Ministry of Education. C-SEC concessions done for children writing those C-SEC examinations are not governed by our local MOE, and therefore the timelines have to be rigidly adhered to. For those secondary school teachers that might be amongst us, it's important to note for the Caribbean Examinations Council, candidates with long-term or permanent disabilities, applications for special assessment arrangements have to be made by the 31st of January if the child is writing the exam in May, June. So if you have Form 5 students with disabilities writing those exams next year, 2023, you have until January to process and submit those concession requests. If the child is writing, very often we have teachers encouraging children to write the exam in January for the experience. If the child is writing an exam, and of course it's for us parents who also have children with disabilities writing the exam, if our children are writing in January, then this is the month where concessions will have to come in for those January exams. So teachers take note, parents take note. If you want your child with a disability writing the January exam, you have until October the 31st. Candidates requesting Braille. Again, those are our blind students. If you are requesting Braille, enlarged print, modified question papers, that request must come in by this October the 15th in respect to the May-June sitting. All right, so if you want the child with blindness who requires Braille or large print to write that exam in June of next year, this 15th of October is going to be the deadline, that is next week. If that child who requires Braille or enlarged print, is writing the exam in January, then the deadline has already passed for the concessions for that exam. All right, so I know that this has been an earful for you all. I apologize, Ms. McPhee, for going a little bit over the time that was stipulated, but I really want to ensure that everyone has a very clear understanding of the nature of concessions and the types of concessions. And so I thank you all very much for your attention. And I turn over to Mr. Seals for any questions that he may have to moderate.
All right. So again, ladies and gentlemen, comrades all, we would like to thank Ms. Garcia of the Student Support Services Division of the Ministry of Education for sharing that information with us. Ladies and gentlemen, at this time, before we take the questions, and you know the way we have been operating in this module for quite a while, so you know how to access the host. You just put up your hand, and then you are allowed to unmute when identified. But I would like to recognize in the house none other than the second Vice President of the Trinidad and Tobago Unified Teachers Association, Ms. Curla Robertson Thomas. She's in the house. Also with her is our newest IRO, Mr. Kevin Kerr. He is also in the house. I saw earlier the President of the association, Ms. Antonia Tika de Freitas. Several members of the PAC and MOT, Month of the Teacher Committee, they are also in the house. So we have also several of our district chairmen. So we have a star-studded audience here today. So the first of all, I would like to take Ms. Marjorie Moore Carrington, again, one of our greatest supporters The first question comes to her, and she opens the button for our questions with this new format. TUTA Saturdays Education Matters. Ms. Moore Carrington.
Thank you, Mr.
And you
Chairman.
could just unmute. Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good afternoon to everyone. Ms. Garcia, I must commend you. You talk about overstaying your time. I mean, I was lapping up everything. I totally enjoyed you. You were very detailed, clear voice, not a voice that is annoying. You have it. You were well chosen to deliver here today. Thank you very much. Two quick questions. One, you spoke about in terms of the having a writer, the person has a physical disability or might have had a short term, maybe an accident or whatever, right? But what about if the person is, the writing is illegible in terms of, well, the teacher over a period of time would understand the writing, but it's not the teacher correcting it. What about that kind of child? Brilliant, but just writes illegibly so that, you know, may really pose a challenge for somebody correcting to read. Can that person get a writer? And two, assessment. You were saying that the assessment for the concession has its time, there are time frames, right? What about if the person is does not have an assessment way back then, and it's something that happened in a recent kind of thing? I am assuming, based on what you said, I just want to find out if I'm correct. The CEO can basically make a decision on these kind of impromptu letters or requests. So that's my two questions.
Thank you so much for your kind words, Miss. So we'll take the first question. In terms of a child with illegible handwriting, if that person can get a writer, the answer to that question is no, if the issue is simply irregular or illegible handwriting. Remember, we talked about that part of the concessions that spoke to us not changing the outcomes. So concession does not reduce the students' learning expectations, and that's really important. And so children's poor handwriting does not develop overnight, right? And so the expectation is that here's this child entering school, first year, second year, standard 1, standard 2, standard 3, standard 4, standard 5. We are not going to wait until standard 5 to identify that this child's handwriting is illegible. This child should have been, intervention, I should say, should have been done to get this child to develop writing skills. So illegibility of handwriting is not a sufficient cause to warrant concession, because you would appreciate that that's a vast number of our children who seem to have, as teachers like to say, the crackle-foot handwriting. And so that is something that has to be addressed prior to the exam. It's the same as the child who is the teacher, sorry, who is saying this child can't read, so we want him to get a reader for the exam. Education prepares our children, even if we look at those 3 basics and forget all the rest, the importance of the reading, the writing, and the arithmetic. And so if you are in a system and the tail end of that system requires the child to write a written exam, which he has to read independently, then the onus is certainly on us to ensure that the child is prepared for the exam, by and large. I'm giving you the politically correct answer. There are some children, however, who the illegible handwriting is part and parcel of the disorder that they have. And so, for example, a child who has a learning disability, a specific learning disability in written expression, what we traditionally call the dysgraphia. part of the diagnosis stipulates that, okay, this child is going to have handwriting that is not only legible, the size of the letters are going to vary. He's going to have big letters, small letters, capital letters, common letters, no spacing under the line, above the line. And that condition is part and parcel of the diagnosis that he has as evidenced by the psychoeducational assessment. So in a situation like that, if it is validated or if there is evidence in that psychoeducational assessment that the reason that this child's writing is what it is because of this disorder that he has, that is when consideration is given. Outside of that, we work with the expectation that if a child is being prepared for an S.E.A. exam, then we cannot reduce the student's learning expectations and say, I'm going to mark him special because he bright, but he can't write. So I hope that answers the first question. In the second question, where you spoke about a time frame of an assessment, the Ministry of Education does provide assessments to children, specifically psychoeducational assessments. The challenge comes in is that because of the amount of requests for psychoeducational assessments that come in, these children sometimes wait 2 and 3 years for the psychoed assessment. I cannot wait until standard 5 to recognize that this child has some degree of challenge and then say, I need an assessment. Teachers are encouraged to make sure that children with challenges are referred early on. While I may know if my child has a seizure disorder or asthma, I may not know he has a learning disability. But as a teacher, I recognize the signs early on. He's not processing in the time with others. He's not completing his work. He's very easily distracted. He becomes frustrated. So there are signs that we could say and look at children and say there is a concern here. And when I pick up those signs in standard 1, or I pick up those signs in standard 2, and I refer, that child is likely to get his assessment provided by the Ministry of Education. So there is not a lack of evidence that this child truly does have a concern or a challenge. With regards to the intervention of the CEO, the CEO's office is not a part, as far as I'm aware, I stand to be corrected, is not a part of that concessions committee. And even if it is there a representative there, that representative cannot make advocate for that child without documentation because it goes against our policy guidelines. If we were to take word of mouth and say, I know this child has a challenge, then that is going to compromise the whole concessions process. And that's why the documentation is extremely important. And so at the 99th hour to now say that this child requires an assessment and he doesn't have the assessment so we can give consideration, it compromises the process of concessions and it is not something that should be encouraged. I hope that answers the questions, Miss.
Okay. We have some hands up again, but give me a moment to recognize in the house none other than the head of the Inclusive Education Department of the Ministry of Education, Ms. Sherma Swan. Ms. Sherma Swan, actually, we got kudos earlier from Ms. Garcia about our inclusive look, the association's tutors inclusive look, and the work we do in inclusive education. Ms. Swan was an integral part of that, and I could still say is an integral part of that push. So we have Ms. Swan. I want to recognize her in the room. Also, one of our commissioners, Miss Angela McAllister, a former study circle coordinator, and another commissioner, but a member of the PAC, we have Mr. Eugene Norville. So again, recognizing these persons in the room. Next question from Miss Lizette Abraham, better known as Paji. Paji, take it away.
Yes, good night, Marlon. And again, let me compliment the presenter. She was excellent. My question is, my son has been diagnosed with ADHD. But of course, the child guidance clinic takes very, very long, and their first priority is to medicate. So I've removed him from the government and put him with a private Everest development learning, and they're retesting him and going from scratch. If I want to apply for the concession for him to get the ability to walk in the exam, to get up and walk around, is that going to be impacted by the fact that he's using a private consultation instead of a public one?
So that's a really good question. No, it does not impact the decision at all. I know that our internal systems in the Ministry of Education and the government systems in Ministry of Health, Child Guidance Clinic, all of these are very slow. And so parents do have the facility to go externally and to get these evaluations done. What we guide parents to do, however, is to be very careful of who you have doing the assessments. There are persons that are charging sums of money and providing you all with a report that does not meet the criteria outlined by the Ministry of Education for concessions. And so as long as you verify as a parent that that person is a reputable person and that person is indeed qualified to make the diagnosis that your child has, certainly when the time comes to those concessions, it will be given considerations. All right, so it is important to know that in terms of the psych-ed assessment, what the ministry asks for is to ensure that it has the intellectual assessment, the achievement assessment. So you're looking at two specific types of tests, the perceptual motor and the behavioral. And all of these, as I said, is online in the Ministry of Education's website, alternative arrangements, special concessions. In one of the appendices, it specifies what is required in terms of a psychoeducational assessment. So yes, mommy, by all means, access it privately if you have the financial means to do so. It is going to be accepted as consideration as evidence, for the concessions at the time of the exam.
Miss, may I just ask quickly before they call the next person, is there a list somewhere that has the list of qualified people? Is that available anywhere?
I believe if you call the Trinidad and Tobago Association of Psychologists, that's TTUTA, they will be able to recommend, or they will be able to present you with a list of psychologists who are functioning and part of the association in Trinidad and Tobago.
Thank you very much.
You're most welcome. Hi, Ms. Swan.
All right, so I was muted. So we have Janelle, followed by Isabel.
Good afternoon, Chairman. Good afternoon, everyone. I came in a bit late, so I'm not sure if this was covered. I have some receipts in my class. However, two of them are looking for concessions. One would have gotten a concession last year, and I want to know if that concession would be valid for the 2023. She did exam this year. So I want to know if that concession would be valid for 2023, or does she have to apply? And the other question that I have is that one parents who would have done the assessment based on what someone in the SSS department would have said to go to the Dyslexic Association to get assessment for dyslexia. And when all the documentation was brought, the child was not considered. And the final question is, what is the date for concession for resets, or have that already gone as well? Thank you.
All right, so first question first, in terms of the resets, and a child who would have received concessions last year, the concession request for the 2023 exam should have been submitted on behalf of the child. Concession requests are specific to the exam year. And so although that child would have received a concession for 2022, it is not automatic that that concession will be given in 2023. Remember, the concessions committee is organization or one small group within the whole Ministry of Education. And so if they don't know, they would not have automatically been informed that this child is resitting the exam. So the only way for us to know that a child is resitting the exam is by the resubmission of the concessions request. So remember that the committee acts in conjunction with the examination section, but it is not part of the examination section. So we're not privy to which children are signed up for the exam. And so by virtue of that, the child has to resubmit, or the school, sorry, has to resubmit a fresh concession for the 2023 exam. So miss, if that has not yet been done, I encourage you please to ensure that that process is followed. With regard to the Dyslexia Association, it is unfortunate that it is said that one of my colleagues would have advised anyone to go to the Dyslexia Association for an assessment. The Dyslexia Association provides screening, and the screening that they provide will say if this child, by virtue of their age and the gap between their age and their performance on the screening tool would require, so the assessment of the Dyslexia Association gives a red flag. It says that, okay, this child is 12, but they're performing at 8 as a result of the gap. This child requires a psychoeducational assessment. The Dyslexia Association and persons therein can therefore say that this child is at risk for, but they cannot say that the child has. Only a clinical psychologist can do an assessment and attach a label of learning disability or reading disability. And so it's important for us to understand that while the Dyslexia Association provides a very critical function, both in the screening and the intervention, the association does not have the ability to give a diagnosis for a child. And so if indeed they were guided by someone in SSSD, it is either that they misinterpreted the information or that they were misguided by the information, by the person. So in terms of the assessment and that label learning disability, only a clinical psychologist can make an assessment because it's specific tests that have to be done. Only the clinical psychologist can make an assessment and attach that label of learning disability. So again, I want to underscore that it was a very unfortunate thing to have happened, but that is, it is not a valid assessment. The association provides screening for children who are at risk for reading challenges. And the last thing is in terms of the deadline for concessions, yes, indeed, the deadlines for 2023 concessions have passed, but I still encourage persons to fill out the concession form. You are just to attach a letter to the CEO's office identifying a reason that the concessions form is coming in, the request is coming in late, and asking the CEO for consideration. And in the office, in the wisdom of the CEO's office, they will decide if it is going to be sent to student support services with the mandate to investigate. So I would say err on the side of the child at this point, although the deadline has ended. Submit the concession through the CEO's office and fingers crossed that he sends it forward to student support for investigation. Mr. Seals?
Thank you again for these questions. Again, I have to recognize in the house the head of the TVET committee, Ms. Susan Joseph Moore, and the person who was instrumental in securing our fabulous presenter today, none other than Ms. Eka McPhee, the head of the Special Education Committee of the Trinidad and Tobago Unified Teachers Association. Welcome, ladies. Thank you for your intervention, Eka. I recognize that you did a very good job in selecting Ms. Garcia, but Ms. Garcia is known to TTUTA. So welcome and thank you again. We have next Isabel, followed by Samantha, followed by Matthew.
Hi, good evening. Thanks for the opportunity. Ms. Garcia, thanks very much for the information. One question. or I should say a major concern, is that teachers have been observing students coming up the levels and would have written documents or letters to identify that this child is cause for concern. One, because of their psycho, in the sense of their performance. They are in the standard 4 at present, but since they went standard 2, they always behave as if they are from an infant level. And documents would have been forwarded indicating that the child needs to be assessed in order to get some help coming up to the S.E.A, because it's recognized that the child basically is not performing at the level that he should. Another is a child who was born with a defect. Medical information came in to indicate that through the birth canal, the child would have suffered oxygen to the brain and other problems. Has a problem remembering, is a little bit deformed in the hand and deformed in the foot, and the hearing impaired. There is documents to indicate that he has suffered that from birth. Now we're talking about 2+ years has passed and no one since has come to diagnose that child to get that proper information to support the need for concession going forward. What do we do? Or what help can be provided to provide those children with the possibility of getting concession? And these are real cases. Hello?
Sorry, I was speaking and the mic was muted. Miss, can you please clarify for me that these children were officially referred to student support?
Yes, if they were?
Yes, if they were formally referred to student support services.
Yes, miss.
All right. So in the case of the students, and again, I don't know the district, I don't know the circumstances, but the ministry does have an obligation if students were previously referred and writing the exam to provide the support through the psychoeducational assessment. Where we have a challenge is when the referral comes in within the year of the examination that has to be written. So I can speak to my district, and I think it's a general practice across districts. Very often, because of the long backlog of children who have to be assessed, we do try to prioritize children writing the S.E.A exam if their referral came in, let's say in standard 2 or standard 3, and we do try to prioritize those children, miss. So it is something that you can follow up with your district officer, because I'm not sure what district you belong to in terms of the students and the school. And so, yes, what we encourage is when there's a cause of concern, you're looking at the children's performance, you're looking at the children's behavior, you refer the children early rather than later. And there is an obligation, I want to underscore that, by the ministry to ensure that these children get their assessment. Someone just needs to follow up with the officer who is either assigned to the school or with the district to ensure that that happens before S.E.A 2023. Outside of that, miss, you spoke about a child who has a defect and there's deformity of the hands and the feet. If this child has a physical condition, what we will need to recommend is that the parent gets an updated medical that speaks to the challenge that is created as a result of this child's physical deformities, for lack of a better word. And so if there is a challenge or something that is wrong with his hand in terms of physically wrong with his hands, and it impacts his ability to hold his pencil or his pen, it impacts his ability to write, to draw lines, etc. And there is an updated medical that is within the year, that alone is grounds for concession for this child for the exam. All right, and so it's important. There's 2 avenues here. One is to pursue the psycho-ed with student support services through your district officer. And the second is if the deformity of the hand is impacting or creating a challenge in writing and mommy or daddy pursues a current medical, that will be sufficient grounds of consideration, not a decision, consideration by the concessions committee. So there's two things to explore: ensuring that the ministry does follow through its responsibility to do the cycle if it is an old referral, or trying to provide an updated medical that speaks to the hand and the issues with the hands in terms of the physical inability of the child to hold his pencil and so on. So those are two recommendations in terms of what we can explore in this current situation. Also, the child with the hearing impairment, you can provide updated documentation for that stipulates that the child has a hearing impairment. As long as that documentation is valid, that child is going to be able to access concession for the exam.
Okay, thank you, Miss. And Miss, the one that we're hearing is the one with the hand deformity and the movement deformity. That's one child. He has a multiple of complication, and he was from birth. So his scenario seems easy to address, just to get the updated information.
Correct.
Okay. All right, thanks.
All right, so we have Samantha followed by Matthew. Matthew will be our night watchman today until the next series. So Samantha,
Good
just unmute.
afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. Quick question. Does a child who is suffering from Rolantric epilepsy consider to have that medical condition to have concession? Because that child who is suffering from Rolantric epilepsy, actually sometimes the seizure does not come with just the vigoring of the shaking of the body, but rather losing time. They don't keep breath at time, so they would just be staring away. And two, I would have heard that the concession time would have gone, but I am a concerned parent, and being a teacher myself, I have my child who is actually suffering from that Rolantric epilepsy to do the exam in 2023. I have been going to several clinics. I guess some persons don't know what it is because it would have been drawn to teachers' attention. You could see the documentation, and I am yet waiting to hear whether I can get concession for my daughter, because there are times she will be doing an exam, especially when she gets overexcited. The body may not shake, but she will just stay still and don't move. So the time would go away from her doing the exam, and then it may be up and she don't get to finish the paper and stuff. So I am wondering, in that case, with that medical condition, because it happens a lot, especially around test time, or when she's overexcited, she just gets still and sits, and the time goes and nothing would be completed. So I'm wondering if that medical condition is part of it, because I'm yet waiting to hear from the ministry and personnel who the documentation would have been sent through to find out if my child will be accessible to the concession.
So in response to that, yes, for the S.E.A. exam, important even with those types of seizures, where, as you rightly said, the child seems to be gazing off and they might seem to be daydreaming, but it's really a seizure that is occurring at the point in time. Yes, those children are able to access the concessions, and
Ms. Garcia, you're muted.
You're muted. Ms. Garcia, you're muted.
are sent forward for investigation. So personnel will come to the school, they will investigate how the disability or the medical condition manifests in the classroom. They will speak to the parent, they will ask you questions like, Mommy, how do you know when a seizure is occurring, what usually happens, how long does it take? That's part of the investigations process. And when those processes are concluded, the investigations information returns to the concessions committee, and that is when you have the medical practitioner able to give his input and so on with regard to the validity of the concession request. And oftentimes the process is not ideal. There are occasions, there are some years when parents are informed 1 month before the S.E.A exam that the concession has been approved. Sometimes we cut it a little closer to the timeline. Parents might receive their information 2 weeks before that concession is approved, but the timeline is not going to be that you will get an immediate response to the request. The only thing I could advise you is to ensure that you have your documentation within that 1 year. And after that, it is just a matter of waiting for the response of the committee. So the response is not immediate. If you have not had the person visiting the school as yet to do the investigation, then that is something that has to come. But oftentimes it is in the March of the year of the exam that parents are informed whether the child has gotten the concession or not.
Quick question again, can this be done privately? Because I have been waiting for a while, no personnel would have reached out. Is there anyone that could do it privately? Because I know it is very concerning to me.
When you say someone to do it privately, mommy, do you mean the medical assessment?
Yes.
Yes, certainly you can go and access private. I'm pretty sure it might be costly, but if you do not yet have a personal doctor, you can go. Because it's medical, I really can't say where you can access it, but certainly if you go to your family's doctor or medical practitioner, they will be able to guide you as to what you need to do to get this assessment done. All right, but if it is through the public health system, they too have an obligation to present you with an updated medical. And so you can pursue that avenue as well, because you have the right to access your daughter's medical files. If she's in clinics, you can make the request now, send in the concession request, let them know that you are seeking updated medical documentation, and approach your public provider for a medical to attest to your child's condition.
Okay, thanks very much.
You're welcome.
All right, thank you very much. And finally, we have Mr. Matthew Noel. Mr. Matthew Noel, principal, will have his say now.
Thank you very much, Mr. Seals. A pleasant good day to everyone on the platform this afternoon, and a very special good afternoon to Ms. Garcia. I'm about to disturb things a little bit, as I am usually cited as doing, but I want to grease the pan first. SSSD has operated in my school since inception. To that end, they have served extremely admirably, and I have been known to boast that I have the best SSSD team. To that end, I would have provided for my SSSD team in ways that I believe no school has provided. Each officer, social worker, guidance officer, special ed teacher, they have their own office space with their own waiting room and all the amenities necessary for them to operate within the context of the job that they do. So I have greased the pan. I came in a bit late, but I'm not aware that the role of the SBIT has been spoken to much. But I want to stand up here today, or at least sit here, and make a comment concerning the SBIT that operates in school. I see it as a gross injustice that SBIT teams continue to function in schools and teachers continue to serve on these teams, they being a critical part of ensuring that referral processes are facilitated and ensuring that students are able to get the help that they need. And they are not recognized in the way that I believe they should be recognized. Since the inception of SSSD, I have served with the SBIT team in its former incarnation. I have served in every part thereof, from scribe all the way up to being the chair of the team. As a principal now, and a principal of a school with the knowledge that many schools are short-staffed, to ask SBIT teams to now function in the way that it used to taking teachers away from supervising classrooms, teaching children in classrooms, I think is archaic, to say the least. I proposed a couple months ago that teachers serving on SBIT teams should be salaried. They should get at least a stipend so that what they do is recognized in the true context of it. Let me break it down a little bit, if I may. A teacher serving on the SBIT team is called upon to supervise another teacher who have to carry out whatever functionaries that are necessary, as has been indicated by the SBIT, to treat with any kind of complaint, any kind of referral that may have come from the teacher concerning a student in the class. By and large, that teacher on the SBIT is almost serving in the capacity of that of a head of department, a senior teacher, a vice principal, and I dare say a principal even. But that same teacher, who may be a junior teacher, as occurs in many schools, because the senior ones don't want that headache, and the junior ones might be afraid to tell the principal no, so they will serve, get absolutely nothing for carrying out a function that far supersedes the role that they are expected to perform as a teacher and the salary they receive for such. SSSD does a great thing, for as much as it is also sometimes visualized as a political football. I know the immense struggles that go on with SSSD, because I know officers in SSSD still holding down as much as 6 schools, and they can be called to go any part of Trinidad and Tobago at any given time to facilitate the mandates of the SSSD. But what is being done to teachers and continue to be done to teachers, so much so that it is now believed that it is a part of their job spec to function on these SBIT teams, something must be done. In the initial stages, teachers on the SBIT teams actually perform the roles and functions of social workers, of guidance officers, of special ed teachers, but they are still being paid as teachers. This must be looked at seriously. We cannot want to create a system that lends to educating the nation's children by plugging the holes that are present because of inadequacies that might exist with the learning paradigm, and we do not pay the people appropriately that conduct themselves in that particular field. Thank you, Mr. Seals. Thank you, everyone. I would love to hear your answer to that, Ms. Garcia.
Mr. Noel, if you see the deep inhale, if you would only have witnessed the deep inhale, how do I respond to that question? I respond to that question by saying I agree with you 100%, Mr. Noel. I think the teachers who function within the SBIT structure really do commendable work, and they really are not compensated in any way for the work that they do, although it is part of the normal process of the school functioning. I'm happy to hear you giving such sound support of Student Support Services Division. When we first came to Student Support Services Division, I believe I would have introduced one of your officers who would have served your school quite well, Mr. Noel. So I really do understand that we have a long-standing relationship, and yours is one of the schools, if we could get all schools to model how Diego Martin Boys RSC treats with Student Support Services personnel, that would be awesome. I don't disagree with regard to the school-based intervention team. As a special ed officer, I really have to reinforce how critical that team is and the degree of service that is given. But when it comes to compensating teachers, and this is where I'm going to pull Mr. Seals into the discourse, there are many functions that we perform, and I'm saying we because I am a teacher, I am an educator as well. First and foremost, before I became a personnel of Student Support Services, I remain a teacher and a member of the union. And I do agree that the discourse has to be a larger one. So although we're coming outside of the frame of concessions, in terms of having officers function and perform duties that are well outside their remit, in a sense, as teachers or as special education teachers. So I share your concern. I echo those same sentiments, and I am hoping that at some point in time we can sit with Ministry of Education when we're discussing these matters to talk about all of these additional functions that we perform as teachers, as special education teachers, as principals, and so on, because it really does have to be part of the discussion, though it does not specifically fall under the umbrella of special concessions, which I was invited to speak on. So I do hope that as union collectively, it is an issue that could be addressed by the union, and that Mr. Seals would be able to add some input with regards to us functioning. And again, I'm saying us because I am included in that cadre of officers, us as teachers, and the multiple duties that seem to be added to us as officers working within the Ministry of Education. So Mr. Seals, I'm going to throw what I cannot answer onto your very strong shoulders this afternoon.
And what I will do, because we are past our time, we certainly, okay, so we have a volunteer, none other than the person who negotiates, the head of our negotiating team, Ms. Curla Robertson Thomas, second vice president. She has volunteered to answer in this meeting. So take it away, Curla.
Good afternoon, Mr. Seals. Good afternoon to Ms. Garcia and to all of the members who have logged in. Mr. Seals, to answer part of the question posed by Mr. Noel and the part of what Ms. Garcia said, yesterday, fortunately for TTUTA, we have been lobbying for a meeting for a while with the new CEO, Dr. Smith, to treat with issues of student support services. And we did have that first session and raised some of the issues that Mr. Noel would have hinted to in terms of the accommodation for these officers, the spreading them thinly across schools and so on. And Dr. Smith has agreed to put a statutory meeting where we can continue to raise concerns that will come up so that we could address them. He would have taken note of the ones brought to us by the members within those groupings and has committed to try and provide some responses to some of what was raised in a timely fashion. He has also indicated that by the month's end, there will be a new coordinator to SSSD, which will alleviate some of the communication issues. But he has committed to have a statutory meeting on the third Friday of every month. So once we are well apprised of all of the issues that are being treated with from persons like Ms. Garcia, and of course our principals in particular, and members of SSD, we can continue to agenda those things and see if we can find a fix and a better solution for all involved.
All right. So thank you, Ms. Robinson Thomas, for that intervention. But I'm going to give Ms. Eka McPhee, the chairman of the special ed committee, some homework now, in that Mr. Noel was speaking specifically about the SBIT members. So teachers who are functioning on the SBIT team, have your committee discuss that and then put your recommendations to IR, right? Giving you some homework. So in your very next meeting, I'm asking kindly for you to treat with that particular issue. Persons who are on the SBIT team, looking at possible ways we could recognize and compensate those persons. Thank you very much for accepting the challenge, Ms. Eka McPhee. All right, so again, ladies and gentlemen, I know we are a little bit past our time, but I notice that you stayed the course. You know, normally in a staff room, when you're in a staff meeting, when you're having discussions and it's coming around to closing time, people are quiet because nobody wants to ask no question to delay so that you leave school. I recognize that didn't happen today. We have persons, everybody stayed the course. So I would like to recognize all of you, comrades all, for staying the course. And I would like to recognize Ms. Garcia for the absolutely tremendous work that she would have done. not only in presenting the information, but the research that went behind it. So, Ms. Garcia, thank you again on behalf of all of the members of TTUTA for your sterling presentation today. And we look forward to next week's engagement. Next week, the treasurer, the national treasurer, Mr. Cuthbert C. Joseph, will be addressing us, looking at the transformation of our finances, right? The transformation of our finances. He recognized from the budget presentation that we have to find new and innovative ways to stretch our dollar. So he will be probably bringing some elastic or some lively next week so that we can stretch our dollar so that we will be able to be to have sustainability in terms of our budgeting. So ladies and gentlemen, next week, please God, same time, same station. Looking forward to our treasurer addressing the transformation of our budget and the way we as teachers operate financially. So good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and goodbye. Enjoy your weekend and be safe.